Canvas. Today is Saturday, and we are here to finish part 2 of our read aloud of the BFG by Roald Dahl. So we are celebrating Roald Dahl Week this week, and I'll be by on Friday night with some activities for you, so hopefully you've done those by this point. Now, if you can't remember where we were in the BFG, our main character Sophie had snuck out of bed to look out the window during the witching hour, which she calls the time when all the grown-ups and the children are sleeping and the dark things can have the world to themselves. While she's peeping out the window, she happens to see a giant walking down the street, and he's coming closer and closer. So let's see what happens. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and huge ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose were 2 bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed to hide under her blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse. From under the blanket, Sophie peeped out. The giant person was staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on her. A huge hand came in through the window. Here's the hand. It scooped Sophie up, blanket and all, and whisked her away. Once Sophie was outside, the giant held the blanket like a bundle with Sophie in it, and he ran off. Sophie, by squirming around inside, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down High Street. He was running so fast his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path, and he crossed it with one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being tossed around like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while, a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running really fast, she told herself, because he's hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. Finally, they came to a cave and the giant ducked inside. It was full of shelves, and each shelf was full of jars, like the one Sophie had seen the giant take out of his suitcase. There was also an enormous table. The giant picked up Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Alrighty, so let's catch up a little bit. Here's the giant running across the fields. And here is the giant's cave. You can see all of his jars and little bitty Sophie down here. And here we see the giant staring hard at Sophie. What do you think he's thinking? Do you think he's going to eat her for breakfast? The giant stared down hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Ha ha! Just because I is giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal!" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful. But And they does gobble up human beings. We isn't giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of the crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around. Ouch, Sophie said. Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey, the giant said. Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble. Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly bruised, and she became rather offended. Why people from Turkey? She blurted out. What's wrong with us? Bone Crunching Giant says Turks is tasting oh so much juicier and scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamorously flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. I suppose that makes sense, Sophie said. Of course they would, the giant shouted. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious, and some is ucky slish. Sophie was wondering, with a bit of a tremble, what all this talk about eating people must be leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings have different flavors. Human beings from Panama taste very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bung dongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, said Sophie. Not the human bean, the giant said. The human bean has 2 legs, and vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make the giant cross. The human bean, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales taste very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about whales. You mean whales, W-H-A-L-E-S, Sophie said. Wales, W-A-L-E-S, is a place, and it's very different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey taste most disgustable woolly. Tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, said Sophie. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Oh, please do, said Sophie. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Oh, that makes sense, said Sophie. They must taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes, cried the giant triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best. And that is all we're going to read for today. So that was a sample of the BFG by Roald Dahl. He is famous for 2 things, making up words So maybe some of you heard our word of the day in what I was just reading. The word was scrumdiddlyumptious, and it means very delicious. So good job if you heard that. Maybe if you write it in a sentence, I can give you a lamb buck if you show me the sentence. The other thing Roald Dahl is famous for is creating really interesting creatures and worlds. So maybe the giant doesn't actually exist in real life, but he has quite a personality, doesn't he? He talks with a very specific style, and that is what Roald Dahl is famous for. Alright, so that's everything for today. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you had fun this week celebrating Roald Dahl with us, and I will see you next week with another video. Bye.